The night was electric. Lights from 1,000 cameras flickered in waves as reporters shouted questions and supporters chanted their unwavering devotion. The ballroom of the Trump campaign headquarters was grand, a stage set for victory, or the humility of defeat. On this night, it was the former. Donald Trump had reclaimed the political throne, a seismic event that the world watched with bated breath. But what no one expected was the moment when the youngest Trump, the enigmatic and largely silent Barron, stepped into the spotlight. For years, Barron Trump had been a figure of mystery. Tall, stoic, and almost ghost-like in his appearances, he seemed content to linger in the shadows of his larger-than-life father and impeccably poised mother. Unlike the rest of the Trump children, Ivanka with her polished public image, Don Jr. with his fiery rhetoric, and Eric with his loyal presence, Barron stayed silent. He was rarely seen and never heard. That changed on election night. The room buzzed as Donald Trump took the stage. Melania, poised and regal as ever, stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The older Trump children lined the stage, their faces a mix of triumph and exhaustion. And there, almost blending into the background, stood Barron. His towering height made him impossible to miss, but his presence seemed subdued, as though he were trying to shrink into the shadows despite his physical frame. Trump's voice boomed through the ballroom. He spoke of victory, of redemption, of making America great again, yet again. The crowd roared, and Trump, ever the showman, basked in their adoration. But as his speech wound down, a moment of unscripted humanity took over. Turning to Barron, he motioned him forward. "Come on, Barron," Trump said with a rare smile that seemed almost fatherly. "Say something to the people." The room fell silent. Cameras zoomed in, reporters froze, and the audience collectively held its breath. This was the boy who had spent his entire life in the public eye without uttering a word to the masses. And now, on this historic night, he was being called forward to speak. Barron hesitated. For a moment it seemed he might refuse. His eyes darted toward his mother, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Slowly, he stepped forward, his hands stuffed awkwardly in the pockets of his tailored suit. He stood at the podium, his father's towering shadow just behind him, and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. "Hello," he began, his voice low but clear. It was a simple word, but it carried the weight of years of silence. The crowd erupted into applause, some cheering simply at the sound of his voice. Barron waited, his expression unreadable, until the noise died down. "It's very nice to see you all," he continued, his tone polite and measured. There was a slight pause, a flicker of hesitation, before he added, "Thank you for believing in my father. He works very hard for this country." It wasn't much, a few words carefully chosen and cautiously delivered, but it was enough. The crowd roared again, their enthusiasm redoubled. Donald Trump clapped his son on the back, beaming with pride. Melania smiled softly, a rare moment of emotion breaking through her usually reserved demeanor. But for Barron, the moment wasn't about the crowd. As he stepped back, his face unreadable, his gaze lingered on the far corner of the room, where a group of reporters stood frozen. He knew what this moment meant. He wasn't just the youngest Trump anymore. By speaking, he had stepped into a world he had avoided for so long, a world that would now dissect his every word, his every move, his every silence. As the celebration continued and the cameras moved on, Barron slipped away from the stage, retreating to the quiet corners of the ballroom. But the world wouldn't forget. His brief words, his quiet demeanor, and the rare glimpse of the boy behind the mystery had sparked a wildfire of curiosity and speculation. And as the night wore on, one question lingered in the minds of all who had witnessed it. Was this the beginning of a new chapter for Barron Trump, or just a fleeting glimpse of the man he might one day become? The party continued well into the night, but Barron remained on the outskirts, watching the celebration from a quiet corner. While his father basked in the glow of victory, Barron had always been more comfortable in the shadows. For years, he had perfected the art of blending into the background, but tonight felt different. The weight of what he had done, of stepping up and speaking, pressed heavily on his chest. He sipped a glass of water, his tall frame folded into a small table by the ballroom's edge. The noise of the crowd and the flashing cameras felt distant here, like he was observing a scene from behind a glass wall. Occasionally, someone would approach him, a congratulatory supporter or a curious reporter, but Melania's quiet intervention ensured they didn't linger long. His mother joined him, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she approached. She sat down beside him without a word, her presence warm but unintrusive. For a while, they just sat together in silence, letting the noise of the ballroom wash over them. "You did very well tonight," Melania finally said, her accent soft and melodic. Barron shrugged, his gaze fixed on the table. "I didn't really say anything." "You said enough," she replied. "Sometimes, less is more." He nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. The world would pick apart his every word, looking for meaning where there was none. He had seen it happen to his father, to his siblings, even to his mother. Now, it was his turn. "Why did Dad make me talk?" he asked after a long pause. Melania smiled faintly, brushing a strand of her chestnut hair behind her ear. "He wanted you to be part of this moment, to show the world that you are proud of him, and—" She hesitated as though weighing her next words carefully. "And maybe to show the world that he is proud of you." Barron blinked, surprised by her answer. It wasn't something his father had ever said aloud, not in so many words. Donald Trump was a man of grand gestures and larger-than-life declarations, but subtlety was not his strong suit. The idea that his brief moment on stage might have been his father's way of expressing pride felt strange and oddly comforting. Before he could respond, a voice interrupted their quiet moment. "Barron." He turned to see his older brother Eric approaching, his face flushed from the excitement of the evening. "Come on, man, don't hide over here, you've got to meet some people." Barron tensed, but Melania gave him an encouraging look. "Go," she said softly. "It's good for you." Reluctantly, Barron followed Eric through the crowd, navigating a maze of handshakes and introductions. He met political donors, campaign strategists, and even a few celebrities who had come to celebrate his father's victory. Most of them treated him like a curiosity, a quiet footnote in the Trump legacy. But one encounter stood out. Dana White, the UFC president and longtime Trump ally, greeted him with a firm handshake and a booming laugh. "Barron!" he exclaimed. "You're taller than your old man now, huh?" Barron managed a polite smile, unsure of how to respond. "Let's get this kid in the octagon," Trump joked as he joined the conversation. "What do you think, Dana? Could we make him a fighter?" The group laughed, but Barron felt his cheeks flush. He forced a polite chuckle, trying to mask his discomfort. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and he certainly wasn't used to his father's teasing. As the night wore on, Barron found himself retreating to the edges of the room once again. He had survived the introductions, the conversations, and the inevitable jokes, but the experience left him feeling drained. He slipped out onto a balcony, seeking refuge in the cool night air. The city skyline stretched out before him, a glittering sea of lights that felt both vast and isolating. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to breathe. He thought about the future, about what this night meant for him, for his family, for the world. His father's victory would dominate headlines, but Barron's brief words would also be dissected, analyzed, and debated. He had stepped into the spotlight, however briefly, and there was no going back. As he stared out at the city, he wondered if he had the strength to carry the weight of his family's name. For years, he had been content to let the world forget about him, to live in the shadow of his father's larger-than-life persona. But now, that anonymity was gone. The sound of the balcony door opening pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Ivanka stepping out, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "Hey," she said, her voice warm and understanding. "Hiding out here?" "Just needed some air," he replied. She joined him at the railing, her gaze thoughtful as she looked out at the city. "You did well tonight," she said after a moment. "Everyone keeps saying that," Barron muttered. "Because it's true," she insisted. "You stepped up. That's not easy, especially in this family." Barron glanced at her, surprised by the honesty in her tone. For all her polished perfection, Ivanka had always been the most approachable of his siblings. "You don't have to be like Dad," she added, as though reading his thoughts. "Or like me or Don or Eric. Just be yourself. That's enough." Barron nodded, her words sinking in. Maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't have to be like the rest of them. Maybe, just maybe, he could find his own path in the shadow of his father's legacy. The celebrations stretched deep into the night, but Barron slipped away unnoticed. He wandered through the quieter halls of the hotel, away from the noise and flashing cameras. The polished floors and ornate chandeliers were a sharp contrast to the chaos in the ballroom. For the first time that evening, he felt like he could breathe. Barron found himself in an empty lounge. The dimly lit space felt peaceful, almost like a sanctuary. He sank into a leather armchair near the window, the city's glow stretching out below him. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. Tall, serious, and a little tired. For a moment, he didn't see the son of a president or a member of a powerful dynasty. He saw just himself, a young man trying to make sense of a world that had always felt too big and too loud. As he sat there, his mind replayed the moment at the podium. The flash of lights, the roar of the crowd, his father's hand urging him forward. It all felt surreal, like a dream he wasn't fully awake from. And yet, it had happened. For better or worse, he had spoken. "Mind if I join you?" The voice startled him. He turned to see Tiffany, his older half-sister, standing in the doorway. She held a glass of champagne in one hand and a gentle smile on her face. "Sure," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Tiffany sat down gracefully, her blonde hair catching the soft glow of the room's lighting. She studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I know this isn't your scene," she said softly. Barron nodded, grateful for her understanding. Tiffany had always been the quietest of the older Trump children, the one who seemed most removed from the family's political and business empire. Maybe that was why he felt comfortable with her. "I didn't really have a choice," he admitted. "Dad just pushed me out there." Tiffany smiled knowingly. "That's how he is. He thinks he's helping, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment." Barron let out a small laugh, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Yeah, that sounds about right." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the city lights twinkling in the background. Finally, Tiffany broke the quiet. "You know, you don't have to figure it all out tonight," she said. "This family, it's a lot. The expectations, the scrutiny, the constant pressure to be perfect. It can feel overwhelming, but you don't have to be like them. You can be whoever you want to be." Barron looked at her, surprised by her words. "Do you ever feel like it's too much?" Tiffany's smile turned wistful. "All the time. That's why I keep my distance. I love Dad, but I've always known I'm not cut out for the spotlight like he is, and that's okay. It doesn't mean I'm any less part of the family." Her words resonated with Barron. For so long, he had felt like an outsider in his own family, like he didn't quite belong in their world of power and ambition. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Maybe it was okay to be different. "Thanks," he said quietly. Tiffany reached over and gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "You'll figure it out, Barron. Just take it one step at a time." As she stood to leave, Barron felt a newfound sense of clarity. He didn't have to be like his father or his siblings. He didn't have to be larger than life or endlessly charismatic. He could find his own path, even if it took time. The lounge grew quiet again, and Barron leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. For the first time that night, he didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt something else, a flicker of determination, a quiet resolve to carve out his own identity in a world that seemed intent on defining him. Back in the ballroom, the celebration was winding down. Most of the guests had left, and the energy in the room was beginning to fade. Barron returned to find his father speaking to a small group of close allies, his booming laughter filling the space. Donald Trump spotted him and beckoned him over. "Barron," he called, his voice as commanding as ever. "Come here, son." Barron hesitated for a moment before walking over. His father clapped him on the back, his hand heavy but affectionate. "You did good tonight," Trump said, his tone unusually genuine. "People are already talking about it. They liked seeing you up there." Barron wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply nodded. Trump leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a more private tone. "You're part of this, Barron. Whether you like it or not, you've got a role to play, but don't worry. I'll help you figure it out." For once, Barron didn't feel the usual pressure that came with his father's words. Instead, he felt a strange sense of acceptance. Maybe he didn't have to figure everything out tonight. Maybe he didn't have to be perfect. As the lights dimmed and the night drew to a close, Barron stood quietly by his father's side, watching the room empty. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. The next morning, the ballroom was unrecognizable. The banners and lights had been taken down, and the once celebratory atmosphere was replaced with the quiet hum of hotel staff cleaning up the remnants of the night. Barron stood at the edge of the now empty space, sipping coffee and gazing at the stage where his father had declared victory. The weight of the previous night still lingered, but there was also a faint sense of relief. The chaos of the celebration was over, and the world outside awaited the next chapter. "Early riser, huh?" Barron turned to see his older brother, Don Jr., walking toward him with a grin. He was dressed casually, a stark contrast to the tailored suits from the night before, but his energy was as high as ever. "Couldn't sleep," Barron admitted. Don Jr. chuckled. "Welcome to the family business. Sleep's a luxury when you've got the whole world watching." Barron wasn't sure if his brother was joking or serious. Probably a bit of both. "Last night was big," Don Jr. continued, clapping Barron on the shoulder. "Dad's proud of you, you know. We all are." "Yeah, I guess," Barron said, unsure of how to respond. Don Jr. studied him for a moment, his expression softening. "Look, I get it. This isn't easy, especially for you. You've always kept your head down, and now, suddenly, everyone wants to know who you are. But here's the thing. You've got something none of us had when we were your age. You've got a clean slate. You can decide who you want to be in all this." Barron frowned. "What if I don't want to be part of it?" Don Jr. shrugged. "Then don't be. But if you do decide to step up, do it your way. Don't try to be Dad or me or Ivanka. Just be Barron." The words stuck with him as Don Jr. walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. A clean slate. It sounded simple, but Barron knew it wasn't. His last name carried weight, and the world would always see him through the lens of his family. But maybe his brother was right. Maybe he could find a way to carve out his own place, even in the shadow of his father's towering legacy. As he wandered through the hotel, Barron found himself drawn to the press room. The space was still buzzing with activity as reporters packed up their equipment and sent out their final stories from the night before. He paused at the entrance, watching from a distance. "Barron Trump!" The voice startled him, and he turned to see a young reporter hurrying toward him. She was holding a microphone, her eyes wide with excitement. "Do you have a moment for a quick question?" she asked, her tone polite but eager. Barron hesitated. His instinct was to say no, to walk away and retreat to the safety of anonymity. But something stopped him. Maybe it was Don Jr.'s words about stepping up, or Tiffany's reassurance that he didn't have to have all the answers right away. Whatever it was, he found himself nodding. "Sure," he said. The reporter's face lit up, and she quickly gestured for her cameraman to start recording. "First of all, congratulations on your father's victory. Last night was a big moment for your family, and it was the first time we've heard you speak in public. How did it feel to step into the spotlight?" Barron considered the question carefully. "It was unexpected," he admitted. "I'm not used to being in front of a crowd like that, but I wanted to show my support for my dad. He's worked hard for this." The reporter nodded, her expression encouraging. "Do you see yourself taking on a more public role in the future?" He hesitated again, his thoughts swirling. He knew the world would take his answer and run with it, but he also knew he had to be honest. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "Right now I'm just focused on figuring out who I want to be. I think that's something everyone goes through, no matter who their family is." The reporter smiled, clearly pleased with his response. "That's a very mature perspective. Thank you for your time, Barron." As the camera stopped rolling, she reached out to shake his hand. "Good luck," she said sincerely. "Thanks," he replied, feeling a strange mix of relief and pride. As he walked away, he couldn't help but think about the way his words had sounded. For the first time, he felt like he had said something that was entirely his own, something that wasn't scripted or prompted by someone else. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that day, the family gathered for a private lunch. The mood was more subdued than the night before, but there was still an air of celebration. Donald Trump was in high spirits, recounting stories from the campaign trail and joking with his children. As they ate, Barron found himself drawn into the conversation. He listened as his father talked about his plans for the next 4 years, about the battles he anticipated and the victories he was determined to achieve. For the first time, Barron felt a spark of curiosity, a desire to understand the world his family had built. When the lunch ended and the family began to disperse, Donald Trump pulled Barron aside. "I meant what I said last night," he told him, his tone serious. "You've got potential, Barron. You're smart, you're observant, and people are going to want to hear from you. Don't be afraid to use your voice." Barron nodded, his father's words sinking in. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he was starting to realize that he didn't have to have all the answers right away. For now, it was enough to take things one step at a time. Over the following days, life shifted into a strange rhythm for Barron. The initial frenzy of election night faded, but the ripples of his brief public appearance were still spreading. His words at the podium and his calm response to the reporter had sparked endless speculation. Every news outlet had something to say. Some called him a potential mystery card for the Trump legacy, while others dismissed his appearance as a one-off, orchestrated for the cameras. At first, Barron tried to ignore it all. He avoided the TV, the news websites, and even his phone. But no matter how hard he tried, snippets of headlines and commentary always found their way to him. "Barron Trump finally speaks," one headline declared, while another read, "The quiet heir. Is Barron Trump the future of the family empire?" It was overwhelming. For someone who had spent his entire life trying to stay out of the public eye, the sudden attention felt suffocating. But amidst the noise, something surprising happened. Messages began pouring in. Emails, letters, even direct messages on social media. Some were from strangers offering words of encouragement or thanking him for showing grace under pressure. Others were from old friends and classmates, people he hadn't spoken to in years reaching out to reconnect. One message in particular stood out. It was from a girl he barely remembered, someone he had gone to school with during his middle school years in New York. "Hey, Barron," the message read. "I just wanted to say I saw your speech, and I thought you did great. I can't imagine how hard that must have been, but you handled it so well. Anyway, just wanted to say hi. Hope you're doing okay." He stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to respond. It was such a simple note, but it felt oddly meaningful. After a moment, he typed a quick reply. "Thanks. That means a lot. Hope you're doing well, too." He hit send and set his phone down, a small smile tugging at his lips. Over the next week, Barron found himself pulled into more family discussions than ever before. His father's transition team was working nonstop, and the Trump children were all being brought in for various roles. Ivanka was already deep into discussions about policy and strategy. Don Jr. and Eric were focused on rallying supporters and donors, and Melania was preparing to re-enter the role of First Lady. "Barron, we could use your input on this," his father said one morning during a family meeting. Barron blinked, startled. He had been sitting quietly, half listening to the discussion about social media outreach, when his father addressed him directly. "Me?" "Yes, you," Trump said, his tone brisk but not unkind. "You're closer to this TikTok generation than any of us. What do young people want to see? How do we get them on board?" Barron hesitated, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. He glanced at his siblings, all of whom were watching him with varying degrees of interest. "I mean," he cleared his throat, gathering his thoughts. "If you're trying to reach younger people, it has to feel genuine. They see right through fake stuff. Maybe focus on being relatable. Show that you're listening to what they care about." There was a moment of silence as the room absorbed his words. "Interesting," Ivanka said finally, nodding thoughtfully. "That's actually a good point." "Exactly," Trump said, clapping his hands together. "See? This is why I wanted you here, Barron. You've got a fresh perspective." Barron wasn't sure if his suggestion had been all that groundbreaking, but the validation felt good. For the first time, he felt like he was contributing to something bigger than himself. As the weeks passed, Barron started to find a rhythm in his new reality. He wasn't taking on a public role, not yet, but he was quietly working behind the scenes, offering input when asked and learning more about the intricacies of his family's world. He still struggled with the attention. Paparazzi were a constant presence whenever he stepped outside, and every move he made seemed to spark some kind of headline. But he was learning to tune out the noise, to focus on the things that mattered, One evening, he found himself sitting in his room, scrolling through a mix of news articles and social media posts about his family. Most of it was the usual commentary, analysis of his father's policies, speculation about the Trump children, criticism from opponents. But one post caught his eye. It was a video clip from election night, showing the moment he stepped up to the podium. The caption read, "Barron Trump, a quiet strength." The comments were surprisingly positive. People praised his composure, his humility, and his ability to handle the pressure of the moment. As he watched the clip, he felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, nervousness, and a flicker of hope. For so long, he had tried to avoid the spotlight, to exist quietly in the background. But maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to be himself, even in a world that demanded so much more. In the months that followed, Barron found himself slowly stepping into a new role, one that was neither fully in the shadows nor entirely in the spotlight. He became a quiet but steady presence in his father's orbit, working behind the scenes on initiatives that mattered to him. While his siblings focused on the political and business aspects of the Trump name, Barron gravitated toward projects aimed at younger audiences, particularly those involving education and mental health awareness. It was his mother, Melania, who inspired him to pursue those causes. During a quiet moment at home, she shared her own experience of starting the Be Best initiative during her tenure as First Lady. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "Many people didn't take it seriously, but I believed in it. You don't have to change the whole world, Barron. Sometimes it's enough to make a difference for just one person." Her words stuck with him, and over time, Barron began to envision how he could use his unique position to help others. He proposed a small campaign focused on providing resources for students struggling with anxiety and depression, an issue he had seen firsthand among his peers. His father, surprisingly, was supportive. "It's a good idea," Trump said during one of their conversations. "Young people today are facing challenges we didn't even dream of when I was growing up. If you think you can help, then do it." Barron threw himself into the project, working quietly but passionately. He consulted with mental health professionals, spoke with students, and helped design an online platform that provided free access to resources and support networks. The initiative launched with little fanfare, but it quickly gained traction, with thousands of young people accessing the platform within its first month. Despite his growing involvement in the public sphere, Barron continued to value his privacy. He rarely gave interviews and avoided social media, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But every now and then, he found himself back in the spotlight, often at the insistence of his father. One such moment came on the one-year anniversary of his father's re-election. At a rally celebrating the milestone, Donald Trump called Barron to the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trump announced with his usual flair, "my youngest son Barron has been doing incredible work behind the scenes. He's not just tall, he's smart too." The crowd erupted in applause as Barron reluctantly stepped forward. Standing at the podium, he felt the familiar wave of nerves. But this time it was different. This time he knew who he was and what he wanted to say. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I'm grateful for the support you've shown my father and our family. Over the past year, I've had the privilege of working on a project that's very important to me, helping young people who are struggling with mental health challenges. It's been inspiring to see how much of a difference we can make when we come together to support one another." He paused, glancing at his father, who was beaming with pride. "I'm still figuring out my place in all of this," he continued, "but I know one thing for sure. Making a positive impact, even in small ways, is what matters most." The applause was deafening, but Barron barely noticed. For the first time, he felt fully at ease in the spotlight, not because he had to be there, but because he had something meaningful to share. As the rally ended and the crowd began to disperse, Barron lingered on the stage, taking in the moment. His father joined him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You've come a long way, kid," Trump said, his tone unusually soft. Barron looked out at the sea of empty seats, the echoes of applause still ringing in his ears. "I guess I have," he said quietly. Trump smiled. "You've got something special, Barron. You remind me of myself when I was your age, except taller." Barron laughed, shaking his head. "I'm not like you, Dad." "No," Trump agreed, his expression thoughtful. "You're better." The words hung in the air, unexpected, but sincere. Barron didn't respond, but the weight of his father's statement settled deeply within him. As they walked off the stage together, Barron felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced before. He didn't need to be a carbon copy of his father or his siblings. He didn't need to fit into the mold the world expected of him. He just needed to be himself. And for the first time, that felt like enough.